Undefeated Bahamut Chronicle is probably the single most underrated media piece series that I've ever encountered. And after finally having finished reading it, after 5 years, and after having watched the anime since it came out around, at this point, it's 7 years ago, I thought it'd be nice to make something a review for. This video is going to be completely unscripted. I'm just going to speak on the series. It is now one of my all-time favorites. It has, in my opinion, the greatest fights out of any series ever. I don't think it's even all that close. It has excellent world building, amazing characters, and it fills this special niche that I think so many series try to fill and really fail to execute on, and it just succeeds. And it's so unfortunate that because the series starts off kind of slow, because it's marketed in a certain way, right, for certain audiences that are not known for being the classiest, that it is written off. It's not taken that seriously. It's treated as this unassuming series. It's just a trend getter. And in many ways, it is a trend getter. It's meant to get those sales by mapping onto cliches and tropes. But the execution of this series is actually so wonderful and immaculate and brilliant that it really is an all-time great fantasy story. And I think so many more people outside of the niche light novel sphere should know about it and should actually take the chance to read it. Now, it's not going to be for everyone because, again, the marketing is quite interesting. But I think if you're able to look past that, you will be experiencing one of the greatest fantasies ever. Again, if you read Undefeated Bahamut Chronicle. And this video is just going to be an off-the-cuff endorsement of the series. I haven't planned out where I'm going to go, but I'm just going to speak my mind on the topic. And there will probably be some kind of spoilers that you might want to avoid, but honestly, it shouldn't be the biggest deal. Just watch the video if you're on the fence. But if you're convinced already, if Mr. Liza Fried's opinion is just that persuasive, then you can go ahead and skip this video and just start reading now. But it's a very long novel series. It's a full 20 volumes. It has a true completed ending, which is actually quite rare a lot of the time. They don't finish the publication, and the author talks about this in her final afterword, which is probably the greatest afterword I've ever read. That's not the most competitive thing, but it was extremely beautiful. After reading something for so long, to see something so beautiful at the very end of it. If you're looking for one now, then unfortunately there's no official English translation, so you'll have to settle with the community translation. Should be not very hard to find, just look it up online. It's not the best translation, has typos for sure, and has some awkward renditions, but even with a translation like that, the greatness of the story is still able to shine through, and maybe you lose some of the literary points, but the actual grand narrative and structure is just as good as it would be in the Japanese. I assume it's simply incredible, right? That wouldn't be lost, this meta level structure. And so I guess I will speak on what it's about now, because I assume that many viewers probably come from search. If you're a viewer that does not come from search, it's quite likely that you don't know anything about this series. So the premise of Bahamut is rather simple. It's that it's set in this fantasy world where they basically have a medieval-ish structure of society on this continent, but they have ancient technology. You can think of it almost as Atlantean, where they have these mechanical dragons, and they're all based on famous mythic dragons, and the special ones are based on dragon gods or snake gods of some kind in different myths across the world. And these are essentially giant robots that a user can pilot like a mech, and they can duel it out with other users, and these are called drag rides, like a dragon ride. You're riding the dragon. It's like a mech. And then there's also monsters called Abyss, And the rides, right, the mechs and the monsters, they all come from these ancient ruins with all sorts of strangeness that the kingdoms and the nations of the world are exploring and duking it out against in order to gain an advantage, in order to excavate more of these powerful mechs, which form the basis of the military. And in the nation where the main story is set, it's called the New Kingdom, there was a revolution 5 years ago in which the main character, who is a bastard prince of the previous empire, starts a revolution against the original empire that was there. And he succeeds in the revolution, but not really. He sort of partially succeeds and partially fails. And so he becomes this criminal who is given amnesty in the New Kingdom, but he has to work for the New Kingdom essentially as a criminal, though he is allowed to live. And there's this legend of a black hero of the old empire who was able to essentially wipe out their entire army by himself in a single night. Right? It's this legendary moment. This black hero, of course, is attributed to our protagonist, Lux Arcadia. So that's the general setup. And then as for how the story progresses through this setup, the main character ends up joining this academy with a lot of very cute girls. It is a harem series after all. And he ends up bonding with them, and together they have to save the world from all sorts of different threats. And it's a very simple fantasy setup, right? There's threats all over the place, and everyone has to get stronger in order to deal with them, and then as that happens, the world progresses. So that's the basic setup mechanically. Now we can talk about some of the deeper things that are a bit more interesting. Let's just start with the real meta level point that I want to make here, which is that, at least for myself, whenever I read a fantasy, I always have a thought in the back of my mind about the idea of a kind of perfect fantasy. I almost think of it as the fantasy you have when you have a dream and you're not sure what's happening, but then you wake up and you want to go back to sleep to finish the dream because it was so interesting, right? Where everything kind of clicks and there's this ethereal feel. It feels like the ancient times, but then also the best of times. And really the last name of the main character is this mythic idea. His last name is Arcadia, which, unlike the liberal concept of utopia, Arcadia, though it's sometimes used synonymously, is very different from utopia. Utopia is this future projection where if we just do everything right, we can build our utopia. Arcadia is very different. Arcadia refers to an ancient Greek state which really did exist, but it's mythologized, and it represents this definite reality that's this idyllic conception. It's not about structure, what we decide to build, but it's already been there, and it symbolizes a more traditional sense of perfection. So it's very different from utopia, the place that doesn't exist. Now Arcadia is a place that very much does exist, and it's a much more authentic sense of the great society, and also in this case, of the great fantasy setting, which is how I'm structuring it. So at least for me, again, when I read fantasies or when I watch fantasies, when I experience them, right, I have this conception in my mind of a perfect fantasy where it's almost like the perfect RPG video game as well, right? It all comes together in this sense, and I can't exactly express what it is because, well, it's not a definite set of characteristics. That's not what it is. It is a sense. It is a visualization abstraction, but not one that I can clearly define. And that's the whole point of it, because the perfect fantasy is also mysterious. It also leaves things to the future, and it keeps you wanting more the whole time through. I think that's what really sets it up. And I think there have been many series which invoke this sense in the very early parts of their runs. I think Sword Art Online is an example which invokes this for a lot of people, right? You look at episode 1, episode 2 of Sword Art Online when they were first setting it up, and ultimately, of course, Sword Art Online today is not really regarded as a great series, but it's because it fails to deliver on this idea of the perfect fantasy. I also think this is true for the first episode of Seven Deadly Sins, the first episode of Seraph of the End, and there are many other examples, actually, of series which really draw you in with the mystery of the fantasy, but they fail to deliver on it fully. And where I'm going with this, of course, is that I think Bahamut is a successful actualization, execution of the perfect fantasy, where from beginning to end, it is able to carry this spirit, and it continues to make you want more, right? Make you want more. What's next? What's the next mystery? And the reason that it's able to do so is I think it's masterfully planned. I think the beginning to the end is just all mapped out. There's this beautiful thematic thread, which I might speak on a little bit later in this review. And so the mystery develops more and more. And just as importantly, the way that the mysteries are resolved, the way that the lore actually answers the questions you have, is extremely satisfying in its closing. It's not so open-ended. It really does answer these seemingly impossible mysteries that it sets up. And that's the thing with a lot of really great fantasy setups, is that the mystery is out of this world, like I said, right? It's like a dream. It's incomprehensible. And I think what makes it feel perfect, makes it feel so desirable, is that you want to grasp the incomprehensible. You want an answer which answers what doesn't make sense at all. And so if you get an answer to what is seemingly incomprehensible, you're getting a perfect kind of answer, right? The more challenging the mystery, the better its resolution. And really the failure of the achievement of this comes from the failure to answer those incomprehensibilities, to do them in a satisfying way at least, to really make the expectation. And I think what Bahamut does is that it actually does answer these crazy questions that it sets up. Once you get to, I'm going to put the volume numbers in volume 15, and then finally volume 19, it really does answer everything that sets up, and it does so in a creative way, and in an unexpected way, but also in this rational way, which demonstrates that the author, Akatsuki Senri, she really did anticipate exactly what would happen, that she had it all set up, so it was perfect in her mind before she put the first word to page. And then, of course, that's not exactly true, but I mean, it's this old idea from Mozart, right? When he composes something, that he has the entire thing in his mind instantaneously, because the intellect actually does not exist in time, and then he just has to jot it down piece by piece in time. And I want to consider that the way that Bahamut is written the same way, that it exists instantaneously in the nunc stans, in the now that stands, and before it is ever put to pen in the duration of time, which it was published over a course of 7 years. So that's the big idea that I really get out of Bahamut. That's why I think it's so wonderful. That's why I like it so much, is because it fulfills this longing that I've had for a story that no other story has fully been able to achieve, though many attempts have been made. So it's almost like, I've tried so many things to get this, and they've failed to do so. And so to see something succeed then is an amazing feeling, of course. And there are some critiques to be had about it. One is that it starts slow, and this is the difficult part of recommending this series, is that the early volumes do seem slow. And I don't think it's because they're written poorly and the author, she really needed time to improve as she went. I don't think that's true, because she was an experienced author at the very start, and I think that on a subsequent reading or on a revisiting of parts of the story, right, even once you have the payoffs in mind, it really is a wonderful story from start to finish. And I guess that's one thing I didn't quite mention. So where these other perfect fantasies they hit you on chapter 1 as, oh, that's what I'm promising, and then they fail to deliver. Bahamut's the opposite in the sense that it sort of hits you in the very start of it, but it peters off. It doesn't seem like it's going to be a perfect fantasy at all, even if you read just the first volume. That's not the impression that it necessarily gives, and instead, it gives the Mecha Harem battle school impression. And even the first episode of the anime, I'd say, right, it's not actually giving off the impression that Sword Art Online episode 1 gives, or that Seraph of the End episode 1 gives, but rather it's giving off a different impression. You don't expect it, in other words, to be the perfect fantasy. You're not looking for that just yet when you start it. And I think the reason for that is that to get the perfect fantasy, you actually can't get that start, because that start isn't resolvable, essentially. And so what you need to get instead is you need a prolonged start, I want to say. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. You need a start that has those elements spread out over a longer period of time in the story, in order so that the little elements, the little mysteries, are not just scenes, but they're fleshed out, they're events. And so then once they become events, then the resolution can answer everything at once, and you get this flourish. And that's what we get in volume 15, where everything clears at once, because everything's been set up in a way. And in order for it to be set up, you need enough detail and bridging in order for it to all work out. And then so I think that's why it actually was necessary that the beginning of Bahamut be this relatively slow thing, so that it manifests its destiny as a perfect fantasy by the end of it, and it really does succeed. Okay, so there's that point out of the way. Next, let's talk about the fights a little bit, just a little bit. The fights in Bahamut are the best. They're better than I've seen in any other novel, in any manga, in any anime, in any Western series. They are simply incredible in the way that they're executed, in the build-ups, the payoffs, the ideological battles, as well as just the pure mechanical parts of the fights themselves. I'll get into a little bit here. Essentially, the strong characters in these series, they have mechs with a host of abilities. So they'll have what are special armaments, which are relatively unique weapons and armor and such that the mechs are able to have. So they might have a whip, or they might have threads. There's different kinds of special armaments, and some are extremely powerful, some are less powerful, but they can be used in very versatile ways in combination with each other. And they'll have a number of these armaments that they're able to become proficient at. But then they also have what is called a divine raiment. And the divine raiment is a truly unique ability, and it's going to be extremely powerful. And it may or may not have a very severe energy cost, or it might have a slight energy cost. The way the mechs work is that they have sort of this limited energy supply that is able to be restored a little bit, but then the user has a stamina, which is more definitely diminished, and you can't really recover stamina. That's only going to go down. So there's different power systems at play, different fuel systems at play, by which I mean. But back to the divine raiments, those are extremely powerful. There's ones that can manipulate gravity, for example. There's ones that can predict the future. There are ones that can teleport. They're able to do all these very interesting things. And so when you get a fight, the characters have to creatively use the armaments at their disposal alongside their divine raiment while preserving their energy, while preserving their stamina as well, because the pilot actually has a huge strain on their body when they do this. And then there's other factors to consider as well, which is that the mechs can really damage each other, and so you have to fight through the damage. You may even be damaged as the person riding the mech before your mech goes down necessarily. you are actually able to survive some of the attacks, especially some of the stronger characters can if they've enhanced their bodies, which is also possible in this series. And there's a lot of strategic elements to the fight. Very important strategic part of most of the serious fights is the information game, where the fighters don't have perfect information about the opponent, and a lot of the fights are about discovering what the opponent's special armament and what their divine raiment is really doing, and then using that information to create a counterattack. But then in finding that information, they often have to make sacrifices, especially to their stamina, possibly to the integrity of their mechs. And you get these very intricate fights where both sides are scrambling, they have hidden information, and then there's also the technique. So I've spoken about the specs of the mechs essentially, but then there's also operating skill, and there's a huge host of techniques. The main character especially knows a great number. He has access to 3 hidden techniques where he uses very specific, almost speed run like movements and controls in order to create these ridiculously powerful abilities, but are very straining and very conditional. He calls them quick draw, recoil burst, and end action. But then he can also use even more ridiculous sort of like manipulations of the system. So you can use this ability called tuning, and then there's an even more extreme version of that called over limit. And then on top of all that, there's also different ways you can apply those armaments and those divine raiments. So some divine raiments have different applications depending on how creative you are. And so when you get the fact that you can combine all these things together, and you have these fuel systems in place where you have limited energy, you have limited stamina, you have limited durability, you have limited armor durability. When you have all of those factors coming together in a single fight, you have a very intricate decision tree that every character is taking. And so the fights are just incredible. Unlike a lot of good fights, so to speak, which are mostly carried by production value, where it is just like one heartfelt attack. I don't dislike those fights necessarily, where you just have a beam struggle, some kind of punch struggle, or maybe someone just unlocks a new power mid-fight and hits the opponent with it and they win. Something like that the fights in Bahamut are all about strategizing, and they are won still quite often by these large attacks, but in order to set them up, it's this huge combo of different attacks and abilities trading off each other and just figuring out the opponent's patterns sometimes in order to catch them off guard with one blow. But then a lot of them also are down to these fatigue attrition-based matches where you're just chipping away and you're just holding a secret technique that becomes harder and harder to land as your stamina diminishes, but you have to hold on to it so that it does land. And the opponent's stamina is also diminishing, so you manage to pull it off and ultimately win. The biggest fights in the series are found in volumes 15 and 19, and those are these massive team fights, which are even more strategic, because now you have multiple divine raiments on each side, and they're interacting with one another, and so you have these team-based, coordinated attacks using the different divine raiments and special armaments, and that going into each other is even more incredible. And so once you put that all together, you have the best fights in fiction. In volumes 15 and 19, I think the one in volume 19 would be my number 1, and the one in volume 15 would be my number 2. And those fights are they're just the best. I don't know how else really to say it. Another thing with the fights, I know I'm going a long time about the fights, but the fights are just so good, and they're part of why this is such a good fantasy, because come on, you have a fantasy, you have this huge power system where everyone's getting stronger, right? What's the payoff? The payoff's going to be using the powers against one another, of course. And I think a mistake of a lot of series is to not take the power scaling seriously enough and make the fights, which are the culmination of everything, feel weak, right? Seven Deadly Sins does this, where eventually it just becomes this numbers game, and it's not that interesting how the fights play out, though there are some big moments again, they're just not that interesting. Bahamut takes power scaling extremely seriously, to the point that when characters get injured after a fight, for example, right, they're not easily able to recover. And they actually have accumulated fatigue in their next fight, and then that becomes a legitimate factor. And it gets to the point where, because the characters need to fight so much, they actually are nerfed a lot, and these nerfs really do affect them, but then they use different techniques to try to overcome it, and they find opportunities to rest, and like every day matters. It's all in the heat of the moment, while at the same time the series doesn't sacrifice those little slice of life moments. In fact, it manages to justify the romance and the slice of life and the little things, right, the character interactions, by setting them in these rest periods where the character really does need to relax their mind, relax their body, in order to recover from the damages that are done to them, because it is quite severe, and they aren't able to keep fighting forever. They don't have infinite blood supply. They aren't these cartoon characters. They really feel grounded and human because they actually do suffer damage, and it does build up, and fatigue is real. Even mental fatigue is real. I mean, how many series really address that seriously in a consistent way, not just as a one-off, right? But all these things come into play in Bahamut, which makes it so great. Lastly, then I'll talk about sort of the major theme that crops up throughout the series, but then reaches its culmination in the finale in Volume 19. The Volume 19 is the finale. Volume 20 is more of an epilogue, though it is a beautiful epilogue, and I may make a video on that at some point. Again, I'm really glossing over a lot because I'm not able to speak on everything the series has to offer because it is so incredibly long and dense and well written. But one of the big recurring themes, maybe the theme I would say, right, the number one theme of this series, actually, well, it's kind of tied with some others, honestly, but it's the one of heroism. It's a question of what does it mean to be a hero? And I guess it's not that recently anymore, but somewhat recently I did make a post on X where I compare Bahamut to My Hero Academia, and I'm not a fan of My Hero Academia by any means, but I do realize there are some striking similarities, and I gain a little bit more respect for My Hero just because it's sort of like a diet version of what Bahamut is capable of expressing in its thematic completion. Because what you have is you have this idea of, the hero, and there's this question of what the right path for the hero is. And I don't want to go into too much detail necessarily, but you have this conflict between a kind of naive hero, which is embodied in the main character, Lux Arcadia, the light of Arcadia, who really just tries to save those around him, but also tries to right things for the better. And then the conflict is with his elder brother, Fugo. And these are rather major spoilers, so if you've been watching but you don't want to hear them, you can go ahead and click off. But Fugo is actually the hero of 1,000 years ago. He is the hero of the beginning. He is the hero of origin. Those are probably just different translations of the same thing, but it is kind of interesting to just say both of them. And he's this great hero who is immortal, and he's been living for 1,000 years trying to, in his words, save the weak. And I think the beautiful thing about Fugo as an antagonist is that he's not an evil person, and he never is. And that's the point. He is a true hero. But he has a slightly different vision of heroism as our main character does. But more importantly, ultimately, right, in subversion of liberal modernity and these modern stories, which are not nearly as good as more serious ones of the past, it's not a morally gray series, but rather it's taking this nuanced position where you don't just have this simple battle between ideologies and, once I have the better ideology, I'm going to beat you with the power of friendship or something. That's not what it's about, but it's rather about the flow of reality and the way that things should be and the assertion of the future and what will be and what must be against a rather similar vision of heroism, actually a rather similar ideological pursuit, but one that has done its time and is ready to pass on. And so the final conflict of Bahamut is really a passing of the torch, a passing from the hero of the beginning to the new hero, the new light, the new kingdom, which is to come and which will ultimately aim to succeed the goal of that first hero who it fights against. And so it's this very interesting vision of what all this means. And I'll get into the symbolism a little bit just so it gets a little bit more sensible. But essentially, I do need to speak on the mechanics a little bit. The first hero, right, the brother of the main character, Fugo, 1,000 years ago, he met this princess of a corrupt empire, the then Holy Arcadia Empire, sort of the original empire, the true original empire. And Arshalia really wants to save the world. She wants to save all the people that are oppressed, and she even wants to save the oppressor. She wants to save everyone. But she also wants to save Fugo, because she meets Fugo just on a random day. He's just a normal guy, but they fall in love, essentially. It's not necessarily stated that way, but it's very clear this is a romance series after all. And they share in this wish to save the world, to save everyone. And so Fugo becomes the hero of the beginning, and Arshalia becomes the goddess of salvation, it's stated. And they embark on this quest, and ultimately there is failure at the end of that road, right? And Arshalia does end up dying, and I won't necessarily spoil the details on that because it's not necessary to do so. But they created this artifact. Arshalia is the great scientist who really did a lot of work with the drag rides. And they created this legendary artifact called Avalon, and the true form of Avalon is the legendary drag ride, the transformation drag ride, Ouroboros. And its greatest divine raiment, its final ability is it gathers the energy of the world through the ruins of the earth, right? All the ruins where the mechs are found. They serve this other function. And they're able to essentially rewrite the perception of everyone on Earth. And by using this ability, Fugo is essentially able to try to restart parts of realities. He's almost able to travel back in time by manipulating everyone's memories. And in so doing, right, when he makes that act, he tries to correct things. And his goal over these 1,000 years, over countless resets of the entire world, is that he wants to find a worthy king who is the philosopher king, right? Who's like Plato's description, who is able to lead the world into a better place and really complete that goal of salvation for the weak, which he so desires. But he notices, right, every time that he does this, maybe it succeeds for a while, but then there's a new corruption in the human heart, and he's not able to succeed in this. And so the symbolism of it is also great, right? Because Fugo, what is he? He is the Ouroboros. He rides the divine drag ride, the Ouroboros. And what is the Ouroboros? The Ouroboros is, in this case, the dragon that chases its own tail, and it goes on ad infinitum, right? It represents this cycle that cannot end. And so, but what does he do? He has nothing else to do. He continues this cycle forever. He continues the cycle forever. Until, of course, we get to the main story, which is about ending the cycle. And Lux himself is actually a candidate from Fugo to be one of these kings, and Fugo judges Lux to have failed. And the reason is because Lux doesn't want to make sacrifices. And Fugo ultimately makes whatever sacrifice is necessary. He sacrifices the whole world time and again. And he kills people and he resets. And, there's this brilliant line. And I have it in my notepad here. So I think I'll pull it up here. And I'll read it. And so it says, the artifact Ouroboros. He would use Arshalia's memento to reset the world and fought to protect the balance. But a hero, something like a hero, doesn't exist anywhere. Before long, everything would return back to nothing. peace would crumble without fail along with the flow of time, leaving behind only Fugo, the strongest and most skilled Drag Knight, along with the strongest and greatest artifact, Ouroboros. That voice just now, was it a fake or perhaps? But the answer wouldn't come. But he continued to fight and search for the answer, in order to carry out the hero's mission, until his body crumbled to dust and vanished. And this is the resolve of Fugo, to fight forever. This is the identity of the Ouroboros. And so the way he condemns Lux is he basically judges him as incapable ultimately, but throughout their final battle, he doesn't call him my foolish younger brother, which is what you'd expect from someone who lacks resolve. No, he calls him my wise younger brother, because he sees himself in Lux. And so in the final scene of Fugo's life, he views Lux. They face each other face to face. And the way I like to picture this is that at the end of the Ouroboros' journey, at the end of its infinite chasing of its own tail, how do you end the chasing of the Ouroboros? You have to show him the flip side of his tail. And so the Ouroboros must see its own face at the end of its chase. The Ouroboros must face itself, see its own face. And that's precisely what Fugo does in the end. He looks at his wise younger brother, and they're of the same blood, actually. They're of the same lineage. And ultimately what we see is that they are the same. That they both are grasping at this ideal of heroism. But this isn't a story where the hero and the villain are the same, right? That's not what the story is about. So how do we resolve this idea? How do we take this picture that the villain was just like me after all, right? This silly idea, and how do we get the more authentic, more serious, more visionary, and more virtuous message out of it? How does the story resolve this, right? How does Senri manage this point without being this silly postmodernist who denies good and evil? Well, the way this is done is that Lux ultimately recognizes Fugo. And Lux says to Fugo, "You are my hero, my brother." Something like that. He can't remember the exact way it's translated, but by the paraphrase, that's what he says, right? No, he basically says, "You are my hero." And the English title of this series, as per the anime and the manga, is Undefeated Bahamut Chronicle. But this isn't the Japanese title exactly translated. The Japanese title is Saijaku Muhai no Bahamut. And that word Saijaku at the front is weakest, most weak. And so what it really would translate to is the weakest undefeated Bahamut Chronicle. Something like that, or just like the weakest undefeated Bahamut. And so there is this conception throughout the series, and it's made explicitly by Fugo throughout the series, that Lux, he really is the weakest because he lacks this resolve. He doesn't save everyone. And that's the very title. And you see this in My Hero, which is interesting. Again, I'm not a huge fan of My Hero, but I do find that connection a little interesting. But then here you have the weakest undefeated Bahamut, that's the main character. And it's almost this contrast, right? How could the weakest be undefeated? How does that make any sense? So wouldn't the weakest always lose? Well, no, because that's not what it means to be the weakest. He is the weakest and he is undefeated and he wins. And how does that happen? Well, I think that the point that Senri makes is, well, think about it. Well, what is the point of salvation? What is the hero's path according to Fugo? Well, the hero is the one who saves the weak, right? A hero is he says this explicitly, a hero is an ally of the weak. So the hero is the hero of the weak. And so if Lux is the weakest, right, he is the weakest undefeated Bahamut, Fugo is precisely his hero. So Fugo is the antagonist, but he's also the hero of the protagonist. He is the ally of the weakest, who is the protagonist, who is our guy, who is also a hero in his own right. He's the weakest hero. But then how do we reconcile this? Why does Fugil die at the end? Why do we have to defeat him? Well, it's because, right, once the Ouroboros sees its own face, the journey must end. And what does Fugil see at the end of this? Why does he accept this defeat? Why does he lose? Or not necessarily why does he accept it, why does he lose in the final conflict? Why is his story able to come into an end? Why does it deserve to come into an end if he's a hero himself, right? If he's doing the right thing, why should he have to die? And well, the reason for that is simple, actually, the way that the story answers it. And it does so by such a beautiful example of tying it all together. Essentially, what ended Arshalia, ultimately, was that she was like Lux, that Arshalia wished to save everyone, right? She's the goddess of salvation. She's saving the weak. And among the weak were rebels, were traitors, ultimately, who betrayed her and killed her. And Fugil, from this point, right, he could not accept this kind of thinking. And he did, right, ultimately take out those who were ultimately opposed to the plan and those that could not be reconciled with, or he wiped their memories, right, and changed their perception. But he forced himself to be ruthless against those who would betray. But Lux ultimately is a descendant of those people that Arshalia saved 1,000 years ago. And so what Fugil is able to say to Arshalia at the end of his mission, when he crumbles to dust, is he's able to say, "You weren't mistaken, not at all." In other words, he's able to say that this mission wasn't for nothing. No. I was the hero. You were right all along, Arshalia. That's what he's able to say to the love of his life, to the love to which he was loyal for 1,000 years, like the greatest romance story, right? He's able to finally tell her at the end, you were right all along. You weren't mistaken, not at all. And so, when the Ouroboros sees its own face, it recognizes itself as having completed. It recognizes that it no longer needs to chase its own tail for eternity, because there is its face. There it is. That's what it's been chasing for all this time. And so what did Fugil want all this time to be a hero? Well, ultimately, he wanted to fulfill the wish of Arshalia. But once he sees that there is a hero from the lineage of those who Arshalia saved, once he sees that the weakest undefeated, is now standing up to him, and that the weakest is the one who defeats him, well, then he sees that, in fact, he has succeeded. In fact, there has been salvation that has been brought to the weak. And so, with that, it is like that the Ouroboros has consumed its tail finally, it's reached it, and that it's crossed over to finally witness its own head. And in seeing itself, it is also no more, because its tail has been eaten, its body has been destroyed, it has destroyed itself to see itself. And so Bahamut is not a Christian story, I will clarify, right? I am a Christian, but this is not a Christian story in a true sense at all. It's not meant to be. That's certainly a pagan story, but there is greatness to be found in these pagan stories as well, right? A lot of great stories have been pagan stories. I mean, the Iliad is a pagan story. The Odyssey is a pagan story. Metamorphosis, right? The Aeneid, these are pagan stories, but they are great stories nevertheless. And so it is this ultimate ending to this pagan love story. The story of the Ouroboros. And that's just a little bit of the symbolism. I might make a video on Fugil in which I really write this all out, and I make a more detailed attempt through the text, guiding through, the little threads and the little details there. And there's so much I skipped over in this review. I mean, I didn't talk about the paladins at all. I didn't talk about the girls at all. All I really talked about was the meta structure of the series and the antagonist who dies and how that maps out. And a lot of people actually are unsatisfied with the ending because they thought, oh, how did they win that ending? It was such a good fight, actually. The plans were perfect. They just see the end of it, the end of the fight, where Fugil's armor ultimately cracks on him, and that's why he loses. And they try to pretend, or they just misunderstand that, oh, it's so unserious. How did that happen? When in reality, it's the most serious thing. And I might explain this more in a video about Fugil. But the way that the armor collapses, I mean, it's like Arshalia telling him, it's fine, your job is done, we've succeeded, it's over. Because that armor, of course, comes from Arshalia. And then the fact that Lux's armor is able to stay up is because, first of all, it didn't take as much damage because of the material circumstances, which are mapped out perfectly. But also it represents that Lux in his romance story, which is also quite significant, of course, it's a harem series, it's the most significant thing, that Lux's romance story, right? That Lisha, who manages his mech, has, in a very limited sense, surpassed Arshalia at this moment. That this mech was able to stand while the mech of 1,000 years finally falls. And so there is that connection as well. But then again, there's the connection of the ending. There's connection that the Ouroboros' body fades, and all that remains is its head as it must face itself. And then there's also deeper points with other parts of his character, which makes it sensible that he would be so strong that it is not his body that fails, but that his mech, the robot around him, fails before his body, because he is the strongest. He is the strongest Drag Knight. And for Lux, it's the opposite, because Lux is the weakest, right? There's all these thematic reasons for this ending and why it's so perfect. And it seems like all I've been able to talk about is Volume 19, because all this does happen in Volume 19, all at the tail end of Volume 19, frankly. But that's all we have time for in this review, and that's perfectly fine, because Volume 19 is the peak of Bahamut. It is the zenith of the series, one of the greatest single volumes of anything ever. It's extremely worth checking out. And so with that point, I think I will close this review. I hope you enjoyed. If you watched all the way here, feel free to leave some likes, give me a subscription, maybe watch some of my other videos, do whatever you want, of course, share with a friend who you think might be interested. But yeah, that's my off-the-cuff, unscripted review of Undefeated Bahamut Chronicle. Thank you very much.